A few days ago, something shifted in how this entire conflict is being managed, and it happened not in a closed-door briefing, not in a formal diplomatic cable, not in a carefully prepared statement. It happened in the middle of what looked like a routine conversation on a business television network. The president sat down with a CNBC reporter on April 22nd, expecting to talk about the economy and the shaky ceasefire with Iran. Instead, 4 unplanned sentences slipped out that changed the tone of everything that has followed. He mentioned catching a ship the day before. He said the cargo was, in his words, far from friendly. He called it perhaps a gift from China. He wondered aloud whether his understanding with President Xi was still intact. And then he shrugged it off as just how war works. No ship names, no route details, no description of what exactly was being carried. When the interviewer pressed for more, the subject changed as quickly as it had appeared. Within hours, the Washington Post had filled in some of the blanks. United States Navy forces had indeed intercepted a vessel in the Arabian Sea. Officials described the cargo using a very specific phrase that intelligence analysts choose with care: dual-use chemicals. The president later added his own detail, saying the Navy had to blow a hole in the engine room because the crew refused to follow boarding orders. By the following morning, Beijing had responded. Foreign Ministry spokesman Guo Jiakun dismissed any link as false association and speculation. The Chinese embassy in Washington sent a separate note to Bloomberg emphasizing that China manages military exports with prudence and responsibility and applies strict oversight to anything that could be considered dual use. 1 ship. 4 sentences on television. A carefully worded denial. And underneath all of it, a story about what this moment actually reveals. Not just about one intercepted vessel, but about the entire state of the blockade, the fragile ceasefire, and an alliance system that has been quietly reassessing its assumptions for weeks. Let's follow the threads that the headlines missed. Start with the blockade. Because the gap between what it looks like on paper and what it looks like in practice is where the real story is sitting. Since April 12th, the United States has maintained a declared naval blockade of Iranian ports. On paper, it sounds comprehensive. In practice, maritime tracking data shows something far more selective. Some vessels get halted and boarded. Others move through without interference. The Panamanian-flagged Satara dared, departed Chabahar right at the start of the blockade, passed within 4 nautical miles of an American destroyer, and reached Gwadar in Pakistan without incident. A Chinese oil tanker crossed the Strait of Hormuz on April 14th with no contact at all. The pattern is deliberate. The Navy intervenes when the diplomatic and operational costs are low. It stands down when those costs would climb, especially with neutral flags, Chinese-operated destination ports, or cargo that risks sparking a larger confrontation. The ship the president described fits squarely into the low-cost intervention category. A cargo vessel whose crew resisted, prompting a response that matched the resistance without crossing into fatal escalation. The vessel was detained, the cargo was seized, and the entire event was then presented publicly as evidence that the blockade is working and outside actors need correction. But that framing leaves out the larger truth. The Navy is interdicting a fraction of the traffic moving in and out of Iranian waters. This is not total control. This is targeted enforcement, maintaining the appearance of pressure while quietly respecting practical limits. And when one of those targeted stops yields something that can be politically highlighted, it becomes the centerpiece of a television interview. Not because that single seizure altered the strategic balance, but because it provided a way to explain why the blockade has not delivered the decisive coercion it was designed to achieve. If the blockade were working as designed, Iran would have capitulated by now. The Strait of Hormuz would be open, oil prices would have normalized below $100 a barrel. Confidence in American leadership in the Middle East would be restored. None of those things have occurred. Iran has not folded. The strait remains effectively closed. Oil stays elevated. Allied governments are expressing more doubt about American management of the region than at any time since the 2003 Iraq invasion. The accusation against China becomes a necessary narrative device in that context. A way to assign external blame when measurable progress is absent, and the strategy requires constant rhetorical reinforcement to keep going. Now here is the detail that most of the coverage completely missed, and it is actually more significant than the interception itself. When one leader publicly accuses another of violating a personal commitment made less than 2 weeks earlier, the traditional diplomatic script is predictable. Protest, ambassador summoned, counter-accusations, perhaps threats of retaliation. That is what escalation looks like in the diplomatic playbook. None of that happened. The Chinese Foreign Ministry issued a straightforward denial. The embassy reiterated export control standards. State media did not amplify the story. There was no statement from President Xi. No formal escalation, no announced countermeasures. That restraint is not accidental, and it is not weakness. It is the most strategically sophisticated response Beijing could have chosen. From Beijing's perspective, the past 8 weeks have unfolded in a way that has strengthened their position without requiring them to fire a single shot or lose a single sailor. The United States conducted a major military operation on February 28th that eliminated Iran's supreme leader, destroyed key nuclear sites, displaced roughly 3 million people, closed the Strait of Hormuz, drove up global oil prices, and strained alliances. Public opposition came from Canada, Britain, Germany, and France. Softer concerns from Japan and South Korea. The blockade itself sits in a legally ambiguous zone that international lawyers continue to challenge. All of that has required Washington to expend enormous diplomatic capital, defending a posture its own partners find deeply uncomfortable. China, meanwhile, has remained on the sidelines in terms of direct involvement, yet it has emerged as the indispensable player for what comes next. The key supplier for Iran's post-war reconstruction, the largest buyer of discounted Iranian oil, the vital infrastructure partner for ports in Pakistan that continue to handle goods. The natural counterbalance to an America whose moral authority in this conflict is now being debated openly even by its closest friends. Every additional day of fighting improves China's relative standing, without requiring China to take any public action. So why would Beijing turn one television moment into a larger crisis? There is no incentive to. China does not need to prevail in this argument. It simply needs the argument to persist, allowing each news cycle to reinforce an image of the United States reacting impulsively while China responds with calm, fact-based denials. The Chinese embassy statement about prudent and responsible export controls was never primarily aimed at Washington. It was crafted for Berlin, for Ottawa, for Tokyo, for Seoul, for Paris, for New Delhi. For the capitals that are growing uneasy with the blockade and are looking for safe, neutral language they can adopt without choosing sides, that statement gave every foreign ministry a talking point they can quote without formally aligning with China. It gave cautious governments cover to create distance from Washington while remaining publicly non-committal. That has been Beijing's consistent approach throughout this conflict, supplying the language of restraint to an alliance growing uncomfortable with American conduct. Every unsupported public accusation from the White House adds to that stockpile of diplomatic material. Every 4-sentence television improvisation without accompanying evidence becomes another data point that serious foreign ministries file away. Let me be specific about the cargo, because the precision of the language matters. United States officials' briefing reporters stayed tightly within the phrase, dual-use chemicals, and declined to elaborate further. That terminology is deliberately broad in intelligence usage. It can mean rocket fuel precursors, missile propellant oxidizers, industrial solvents with both civilian and military applications, materials restricted under some export regimes but entirely unremarkable under others. Had the cargo been unambiguously military, complete missiles, guidance systems, explosive ordnance, photographs would almost certainly have been released. The president's communication style has long favored clear visual evidence of adversaries being caught in the act. The absence of any manifest, any specific identification, or any imagery tells you something. It suggests the material was restricted, but not the kind of high-drama discovery that lends itself to dramatic graphics. And there is a reason for that absence beyond classification concerns. Open-source reporting from the past 2 weeks points to where the most significant Chinese military assistance has actually been arriving. CNN, drawing on 3 American intelligence sources, detailed Chinese preparations to deliver man-portable air defense systems, the FN-6 variant routed through third countries to obscure their origin. Regional outlets followed with accounts of 6 Chinese military cargo planes landing in Iran during the ceasefire window, delivering air defense components and export versions of supersonic anti-ship missiles connected to the YJ-12 family. If those accounts are accurate, and the convergence of sourcing suggests they likely are, then the most consequential Chinese assistance arrived by air through deliberately obscured channels. not via open sea routes vulnerable to the American carrier strike group maintaining the declared blockade. That makes the intercepted vessel far more likely to have been a gray zone shipment, industrial chemicals tied more to reconstruction than immediate offensive capability, or materials whose military relevance depends entirely on how the inspecting party chooses to frame them. This is why the word gift did such precise rhetorical work in that television interview. It is not a legal term. It is not an intelligence classification. It is a framing device that implies deliberate malice while remaining vague enough to resist easy fact-checking. It echoes the same register the president used when characterizing Obama's 2016 payment as green cash. Both constructions impose a political overlay on facts that are either too layered or too inconvenient for on-camera explanation. One more specific detail from the president's own account that deserves attention, and has not gotten nearly enough. He said the Navy had to blow a hole in the engine room because the crew refused to follow boarding orders. That is an escalation beyond standard naval interdiction practice. Typical boarding operations use warning shots, targeted disabling fire on rudder or propulsion systems, or helicopter-assisted non-lethal boarding procedures. Engine room damage assumes sustained resistance and carries real risks: casualties, potential chemical spills if volatile materials were aboard, or even the vessel sinking before its cargo can be properly secured and cataloged. The decision to use that level of force and then publicize the interdiction without accompanying imagery of what was recovered hints at a specific possibility. What was found may have been compromised during the operation, less dramatic than initial intelligence suggested, or politically sensitive in ways that photographs would have complicated rather than clarified. Any of those explanations aligns with an approach that placed emphasis on who sent the shipment rather than what the shipment actually contained. This pattern of rhetorical improvisation is being watched with particular attention in Ottawa. And Canada's position in this moment is one that almost no American outlet has properly covered. For the past 2 weeks, Prime Minister Mark Carney has been navigating a diplomatic tightrope no recent Canadian government has faced. He has voiced opposition to the blockade, using carefully chosen language that stops short of directly confronting Washington. He has quietly aligned with the United Kingdom, Germany, and France on joint legal reviews of whether the operation meets international humanitarian law standards. He has called for protection of civilian infrastructure without naming the American president personally. That calibrated approach was already under strain before the CNBC interview. Humanitarian conditions inside Iran continue to worsen. Allied coordination is moving from internal legal assessments toward the first outlines of a shared public position. Germany has begun floating ideas for a humanitarian corridor. Domestic pressure inside Canada is building, including from voices within Carney's own party, who have been studying the latest UN reports closely. The president's public accusation added a new dimension to that pressure. When the leader of the United States levels a charge of weapons agreement violations in the middle of a conflict where the legality of America's own conduct is being privately questioned by its closest partners, those partners have to decide something. Do they accept the framing? Or do they view it as further evidence of a strategy under strain? Early indications from Ottawa point to considerable skepticism. Canadian intelligence has been monitoring Chinese military transfers through third countries for weeks, working alongside allied services. Canada holds no illusions about Beijing's activities. The doubt centers instead on the timing, the public platform chosen, and the decision to bypass established diplomatic channels that normally involve documented evidence before a public accusation. From Ottawa's perspective, that kind of improvised public statement signals an administration prioritizing tactical domestic messaging over orderly strategic diplomacy. It suggests a confrontation with China being performed for audiences at home rather than negotiated for lasting international resolution. And those signals carry consequences that reach far beyond this week's headlines. The Trans-Mountain expansion, which has been loading tankers for Asian markets throughout this crisis, is no longer viewed solely as an energy project. It functions as a strategic hedge. The LNG Canada Phase 2 expansion, moving through approvals, is seen not just as a commercial decision, but as deliberate positioning. Discussions between Ottawa and the premiers of Alberta and British Columbia about pipeline infrastructure are about more than royalties. They are about designing Canada's economic geography for a future in which the United States may prove a less predictable partner. Every tanker departing British Columbia terminals for buyers in Japan or South Korea represents one such choice being made in real time. Every quietly negotiated procurement contract in Tokyo or Seoul for North American grain or liquefied natural gas is another. Every legal memorandum shared among Ottawa, London, Berlin, and Paris evaluating the blockade's lawfulness is one more. Those decisions are being shaped right now by observations of how the United States is managing this conflict. The CNBC interview registers as one more data point in a directional trend. And the direction it is pointing is away from uncritical alignment and toward deliberate hedging. That repositioning is not a prediction for some distant future. It is underway right now. Let me bring this back to what the single intercepted vessel actually tells us about the broader state of play. Because the ship was one ship, the cargo was one load. But together they illuminate something larger. The accusation did not occur in isolation. It landed during a ceasefire period in which the administration is reportedly pursuing a $20 billion asset unfreezing deal with the same Iranian government described for years as among the most dangerous on Earth. It surfaced amid a blockade that legal advisors in Canada, Britain, Germany, and France have privately determined falls short of impartiality and proportionality requirements under international maritime law. It arrived in an environment where the credibility of American statements had already been tested by visible gaps between earlier rhetoric and current policy. The vessel was stopped. The charge was leveled. The denial was issued. The cargo has not been publicly displayed. The mines are still in the water. Tankers are still stranded in the Gulf. The ceasefire exists in a strange state of holding and being violated and persisting simultaneously, a state that cannot endure indefinitely. Somewhere in the Indian Ocean right now, satellite tracking follows another cargo vessel. Another captain weighs the risks of transit. Another insurer calculates premiums. The gift from China episode may eventually fade from memory, as a few sentences uttered on business television during a conflict that kept evolving long after those words lost their relevance. But the dynamics it exposed will not fade. The substitution of public accusation for verifiable enforcement, the accumulation of leverage by a power practicing calculated restraint, the growing sophistication with which allied capitals are now observing both. Those realities will shape the eventual peace. They will guide the decisions middle powers make about energy security, trade routes, and long-term alignment. Choices that are already being finalized in real time. The story most outlets are telling about 4 sentences on CNBC misses what actually matters. It is not about one ship or one off-the-cuff remark. It is about what those 4 sentences revealed, about a blockade that is selectively enforced, a China strategy that is rhetorically improvised rather than systematically executed, and an alliance system that is drawing its own conclusions in real time about what follows when the strongest power in the world substitutes accusation for documented results and expects its partners to absorb the fallout. The tankers are still waiting. The quiet recalibrations continue. And the realignment, slow but unmistakable, is already reshaping what comes next. And that is where the shift becomes structural rather than situational. Because what you are seeing is not just a reaction to a single moment in a single conflict. It is a recalibration of how power is interpreted, not declared, interpreted. And interpretation is what drives long-term alignment decisions, not speeches, not press conferences, observed behavior over time. Then there is the concept of selective enforcement. Because a blockade that exists in theory, but not in consistent practice, sends a specific signal, not of total control, of conditional control. And conditional control invites testing. From adversaries, from neutral actors, from partners trying to understand where the boundaries actually are. That is the risk, not immediate breakdown, gradual probing, incremental adjustment. Each actor recalibrating based on what they see rather than what they are told. Then there is the role of China in that equation, described as practicing calculated restraint. That is a strategy, not passive, not reactive, deliberate. Because restraint in a high-tension environment creates contrast. It positions one actor as measured, while another appears volatile. That contrast matters, not in a single moment, across multiple observations, and over time it influences perception, which influences alignment. Then there is the alliance system, often treated as static, but it is not. It is dynamic, responsive, constantly evaluating, not only commitments, execution, consistency, reliability, those are the metrics that matter. And when those metrics are questioned, even subtly, the system begins to adjust, not publicly, quietly, through policy shifts, through new agreements, through diversification of risk. That is the recalibration. Then there is the energy dimension, because tankers waiting is not just a logistical issue, it is a signal of uncertainty, of risk, of cost. And energy markets respond to that, not emotionally, structurally. Routes change, suppliers diversify, storage strategies adjust. Those are long-term decisions, made in response to repeated signals, not isolated events. Then there is the trade route implication, because disruption in one corridor forces consideration of alternatives. Even if those alternatives are less efficient, less direct, they become part of the calculation, because reliability becomes as important as efficiency. And once alternative routes are developed, they do not disappear when the original route stabilizes. They remain as options. That is how systems evolve, through redundancy. Then there is the concept of rhetorical improvisation, because strategy communicated through improvisation lacks predictability. And predictability is what allies value, not perfection, consistency, the ability to anticipate behavior, to plan accordingly. When that predictability is reduced, planning becomes more complex, more cautious, and caution translates into diversification, less reliance on a single actor, more hedging. That is the adjustment. Then there is the accumulation of leverage by restraint, because leverage is not only built through action, it is built through the perception of control, of discipline, of the ability to choose when to act and when to wait. That perception grows when others act impulsively, because it creates contrast, and contrast clarifies choices. Then there is the role of middle powers, often underestimated, but critical in this context, because they are the ones making incremental adjustments. Energy contracts, trade agreements, security partnerships, each decision small in isolation, but cumulative in effect. And those decisions are already being made based on current observations, not future assurances. Then there is the temporal dimension, because realignment is slow, almost imperceptible at first, but once it reaches a certain threshold, it becomes visible, not as a sudden shift, as a pattern of consistent movement in one direction. That is what is described as unmistakable, not because it is dramatic, because it is sustained. Then there is the disconnect between coverage and reality. Focus on statements, on moments, on headlines, while the underlying dynamics operate on a different timeline, a longer one, less visible, but more consequential. That is the gap, and that gap shapes understanding. Then there is the implication for future conflict resolution, because the eventual peace will reflect these adjustments, not the initial conditions, not the early statements, the accumulated decisions made during the conflict. Energy diversification, trade route development, alliance recalibration, all of which will influence the terms, the structure, the durability of any agreement. Then there is the concept of expectation, because partners expect a certain standard, not perfection, but consistency between words and actions. And when that expectation is not met, adjustments follow, not necessarily rejection, recalibration. That is the nuance. Then there is the feedback loop, behavior observed, interpretation formed, decision made, behavior adjusted, observed again. That loop continues, refining alignment over time. Then there is the strategic cost of accusation without enforcement, because accusations create expectations of response, of follow-through. And when those expectations are not met, credibility is affected, not immediately, gradually, across multiple instances. That is the accumulation. Then there is the role of markets, often overlooked in geopolitical analysis, but central, because markets respond to risk, to uncertainty, to signals, and their responses influence policy, energy prices, shipping costs, insurance rates, all feeding back into decision-making. Then there is the institutional learning process. Governments observe, adapt, update strategies based on what they see, not what they are told. That is the practical reality. Then there is the long-term alignment question, not who is aligned today, who will be aligned in 5 years, 10 years, based on current trends. That is where these dynamics lead. Then there is the final layer, what this means for power itself, because power is not static. It is relational, dependent on perception, on behavior, on consistency. And when those elements shift, power shifts. Not dramatically, but meaningfully, over time. Then step back, Look at the full arc. A statement made, a blockade partially enforced, tankers waiting, allies observing, adversaries calculating, middle powers adjusting, markets responding, strategies evolving, all connected, all moving. That is the system, not driven by one event, by the accumulation of signals. Then there is the inevitability of change, because once recalibration begins, it does not stop easily. It continues until a new equilibrium is reached, and that equilibrium will reflect the decisions being made now, not the statements being made now. Then there is the final point. The realignment described is not a prediction, it is an observation of changes already in motion. And those changes will define what comes next, not the headlines, not the commentary, the decisions made quietly, in response to what has been observed. That is where this leads. And that is why it matters, not for what was said, for what is being done. Because what is being done is what shapes the future, and that future is already taking form, slowly, but unmistakably, under conditions that are no longer the same as they were before, and will not return to what they were. Because once alignment begins to shift, it does not reverse easily. It settles into a new pattern, defined by the choices being made now, and those choices are already underway, beyond the headlines, beyond the statements, in the quiet recalibrations that determine how the system actually functions. That is the reality, and it is still unfolding, but its direction is already visible for those watching closely enough to see it. And the next signal to watch is not what is announced, but what is quietly omitted. Because in periods of realignment, absence becomes as informative as presence, which meetings are not scheduled, which agreements are not renewed, which routes are not prioritized. Those gaps tell a story, not immediately, but over time as patterns form, then there is the language shift, subtle changes in how partners describe coordination. From aligned to consulting, from joint to parallel, from committed to considering. Each word choice reflects a recalibration, not dramatic, but deliberate. Because language often moves before policy does, it prepares the ground, signals intent, tests reaction. Then there is the institutional hedging that follows. New committees, new working groups, new bilateral frameworks that sit alongside existing alliances, not replacing them, supplementing them. That is how systems adapt without declaring rupture. They layer. They diversify. They create optionality. Then there is the private sector dimension again. Shipping firms adjusting insurance models, energy companies locking in alternative supply contracts, financial institutions recalibrating exposure. All of it happening outside formal political announcements, but influencing them. Because governments respond to the realities those actors create. Then there is the strategic patience factor. Some actors will wait, observe longer, gather more data before making visible moves. Others will act early, securing advantage, accepting risk. That divergence creates further differentiation, in alignment, in posture, in influence. Then there is the feedback into domestic politics, because external shifts eventually become internal questions. Why are costs changing? Why are routes shifting? Why are partnerships evolving? Those questions move from expert circles into public debate, and public debate shapes policy. Then there is the final layer of continuity. Even if immediate tensions ease, even if the blockade resolves, the adjustments made during this period do not disappear. They remain embedded in contracts, in infrastructure, in strategic thinking. That is the lasting effect, not the moment. The memory of the moment translated into structural change, and that structure persists long after the headlines move on. Which is why the quiet recalibrations matter more than the visible confrontations, because they are the ones that endure, and they are already defining the contours of what comes next, even before the current chapter has formally closed.